Hello, students. Let's cover Chapter 4 in Lifespan Development. This chapter is all on health, so it's very useful if you are going into a healthcare field, whether you're going to be a nurse, doctor, physical therapist, all these kinds of things. This gives you a very brief overview of a lot of health things to be aware of at every point of life. The book does a really good job tracking a couple of those things. In the lecture, we'll focus on a couple things more specifically, like dive into a little more depth than the book does, but we won't get the breadth that the book does. So definitely make sure, especially if you're going into one of those healthcare kinds of fields, take some time to read this whole chapter. It isn't a super long chapter, so that is helpful for it. All right, first thing we will talk about is health across the lifespan in general. Some major risk factors across the entire lifespan are poverty. If you are in poverty, you might not have consistent health care. You might go to the doctor when you just really, really have to, rather than being able to go to regular checkups once a year. So that really makes it so things that could be prevented often do get missed. If you're in poverty, there's possibility of malnourishment, so not getting the vitamins, minerals, calorie intake that you're needing, maybe not having healthy food. And so that is a really big risk from being in poverty. A lot of places around the world have that poor food access and have no access to clean water. And so that is a real big challenge, because if we don't have clean water, if we don't have healthy food, if we don't have appropriate sanitation facilities, it makes things much harder, much more likely to get things like infections, much more difficult for body to consistently be fighting off things. Your body is always stressed rather than relaxed. If you're in poverty, you have your fight and flight system active more often than someone who wouldn't be in poverty. And so your immune system in general is not working as optimally. If you have so much of that stress hormone in you, you are not going to fight off infections as well. So you'll notice this in anything as simple as a wound not healing as quickly because of high stress, to things like recovery from surgery being longer because of that, the poverty, the stress, the challenges that are there. And so that is one that really is relevant across the entire lifespan. So anytime you can do things to decrease the stress of patients, help them have less stress, improve their lives in some way, can be very, very helpful. And so a lot of these things are not things that necessarily individuals can do. We need more systems level change for these kinds of big problems that affect so many people. But that risk factor of poverty, poor food access, sanitation, and not having access to clean water are a really big impact on health across the lifespan. So the book does go into a little bit on UNICEF, which is an organization for the UN that counts and tracks and also provides resources for children worldwide to reduce poverty. And essentially what they find is that we have tons of preventable deaths of children across the world because they are living in poverty. They don't have access to nutrition. So just reducing poverty a little bit, improving nutrition a little bit, making sanitation a little bit better, making education a little bit better, and increasing access to health services can save so many lives that it is remarkable how many humans that we lose because of these problems in the world. With that being said, it is a good organization to go and look at a bunch of data for and that kind of things. A program here in Washington that fights some of those same problems is the WIC program. And this is countrywide, but each state kind of manages their own program. So there are different rules and regulations and lines to be able to reach those services or not. So WIC is Women, Infants, Children. So essentially, if you are pregnant or have a young child, um, it's either like till they're 5, 6, 7, or 8, something like that. You can get resources, food, for example, for children of those various ages. And so if that applies to you or someone you might know, there are people that I am friends and family members of that they don't think that they would qualify, but when they apply, they say, oh, maybe they realize that, oh, I am much closer to the poverty line than I thought that I was. And so definitely something to apply for. It's super helpful. It's one of the programs that we've seen some really startling, maybe not startling, if you're a person who thinks of, say, Maslow's hierarchy of needs and getting those basic needs met to be able to meet some of those other needs. And as we talked about earlier on in the class, you don't have to have those basic needs met to have like the self-actualization, but it's way easier, right? There's much less stress. There's much less demands that you can focus on those other things in that hierarchy. But what we see is that when we provide people with food or a little bit of resources, that they are able to thrive so much easier. And that is something, especially as a positive psychologist, especially as a positive developmental psychologist, that I would like to see more of those types of programs in my community so that we are supporting and helping the people that need that support and help. And from that, we see a remarkable amount of data that shows that it works, that WIC programs countrywide work. We see children's grades are much higher when they've been involved in a WIC program versus not. We see that their job outlooks and outcomes and their income levels later on are much higher having done WIC. We also see that and this is really the thing that convinces like politicians. Um, is well one of the things we'll talk about evaluation, maybe I'll mention in a second. We see them putting more money into the economy, so like they make a stronger economy. They're less of a they're giving back more in things like whether it be taxes or in their work at whatever they're doing. They are being a bigger part of the economy after they have gone through the WIC program. So it is a really fantastic investment, even if it's like you're taking a 1-year-old kid, providing them food, providing them things like well, if they're like 1 year old, maybe baby formula, that kind of thing. And then you see that once they're like 18, they are putting more into society than they would have been had they not been part of that program. So that's one of those things, those kind of long-term outcomes. That's kind of hard to think about and be like, oh, yeah, well, we'll see those investments profit later on. Um, Another thing that does actually help convince politicians as well is stories, is anecdotes. So having a couple kids come into their office that are of varying ages and literally talk about, hey, because of WIC, I got to have like this food and I did better in school. I wasn't hungry anymore. I wasn't as tired anymore, right? Having like that face-to-face contact and a story that they can like pick up on. Because really human brains are really good at stories, remembering stories. Most of our human oral tradition for thousands and thousands of years was just passed on through stories. So human brains are really good at remembering stories, grasping onto them, and taking like nuggets of information from them that we can use in our life. So that kind of like long-term data really shows, yes, these programs work and they work really well. But also, if you're trying to convince, say, a politician, bring in some people that are benefited from the program. Show them a really concrete example of this person was kind of like on this track, and because of this program, now they're on this track, and look how good it is for their life and for their community. So, just a little bit of evaluation information there. But yeah, these kinds of things, these deaths are preventable. Many of these deaths worldwide, not just in the US, but there are programs in the US across the world that try to fight this, but more of those are useful. So with this, we've talked about some risk factors. What are some protective factors for health across the lifespan? Well, one that your book focuses on is immunizations. And yep, that's true. It is a protective factor. It's literally protecting you from different illnesses across your life. Preventing accidents. And so that is true across through childhood, but we also see accidents in early adulthood as well. So for children, safe play like parent monitoring, making sure they have proper car seats, but even into early adulthood, safer behaviors in regards to driving, less risk-taking behaviors. That might be things like not drinking and driving as well. But what you can do to prevent accidents using safety gear, things like that. I remember one time I worked in a factory for a little bit. We built like elevator components, and so I was grinding on a elevator door that we were going to basically epoxy together, and the blade basically came off and went right into my safety glasses. That would have been a lot worse of an accident had I not been wearing safety glasses. So I'm very glad that I did. It did cut me like above and below the safety glasses, but yeah, it was like right at my eye. Anyway, other things that are protective factors are some of those things that are opposite of those risk factors. So eating healthy. Another big one that we'll focus on today is also exercise. So exercise is a big one across the lifespan. So both eating healthy and exercise at every stage of life is very important for a healthy body, being able to do things like fight infections, bounce back, be more resilient. Access to healthcare services as well, making that easier is a very big thing. So again, even if someone's in poverty, if they're needing a doctor and they can't get to the doctor, that's a big problem. And then parent monitoring. So we'll talk about in some other chapters how parenting changes over the lifespan, but having an involved parent that is helpful or is really helpful all throughout childhood and into adolescence. So here is a little graph from your book about the types of immunizations you should be getting at different ages. So hopefully you know that something about your immunization record and you can keep track of that. All right, because it is a big protective factor. Some of these things like polio have been essentially eradicated because of immunization. So hopefully with these comments about risk and protective factors, you can see that a lot of these are more community, society, and cultural level things to help prevent and protect from these risk factors. So these are things that maybe your family can support or your church can help with. And obviously the health services is a big part of that. But we're really looking at these more system level changes that need to happen to have good health and well-being for people across the lifespan. So again, your book does go into a little more detail about more specific, well, it touches on a lot of things that we're not going to have time to cover in this lecture, but I have a few things that I do want to focus on. So we'll jump all the way up to adolescence. One of the big things for adolescents is that they aren't getting enough sleep. So depending on when we have the chapter on brain development and puberty, you'll learn that adolescents start oozing melatonin into their brains later than most other people. So even children or older adults or early adults all pretty much tend to be starting to release melatonin in between, say, 9 and 11. For an adolescent, it's not usually closer to until closer to 1 a.m. And so that leads them to go to sleep later, be more active and engaged, and makes them more tired in the morning. A big problem with that is that middle schools and high schools start quite early, especially high schools, because then we basically all the population there is in adolescence. So it starts too early in most places in the United States. And lower sleep is related to things like depression, poor cognitive performance, more delinquency, so missing out on school, missing out on lessons, and having a harder time understanding school material. So this is a really big problem when we're wanting students to do well and engage with the material and learn. If their first three classes are when their body wants to be asleep, they're not getting a whole lot from those couple classes. Another thing is oftentimes we see students kind of fall asleep soon after, say, a lunchtime or around, you could say they're taking an unintentional siesta in kind of the middle of the day. And that actually happened to me in a physics class in high school. I was really excited for this physics class because at that time I was really thinking that I would be going into physics. And I did start in the physics program, but switched over to psychology in college. But I started in physics because I was interested in it. But that's why I was so interested in this physics class in high school. But I had a before school class. And so I was actually starting my day, like starting my school day at, I think it was like 6:30 is when we got to this before school class. And then school started at like 7:20. So it was like a 40-minute thing. And then we went over to the school. It was really bad for adolescent brains. Anyway, the point of it is I was starting too early. I should have still been asleep for a longer period of time than I was. And so because of that, I would fall asleep every single class. I could not help it. Probably not every single class, but it was like 70% of the classes. And I couldn't help it. The teacher literally couldn't wake me up a few of the times. And it was just awful. And so I didn't do too well in that class because I missed a giant chunk of the content. And that is true for a lot of adolescents. They really need to have later start times for adolescents because their brains are letting the melatonin out later and they need to be sleeping a little bit later. So adolescents need to sleep around 8 or 9 hours. With that, high school should probably not start until 8:30 or even 9, and that's not the case for most places in the United States. So in an in-person class, I often ask people like, what was the earliest time they started high school? And have that discussion in class. So your time was probably before that. I had a student just the other day mention that they went to boarding school and their start time was basically waking up. I think they said like 5:20 and then they had to be in their first class at like 5:45 a.m., which is absurd. But yeah, this is when those classes should start. But a lot of places don't do that because we have things like after school sports as well. And that gets students back home really late, and that's hard for parents. So a lot of this is adjusted around adult schedules, both the teachers, administrators, the parents. Uh, California recently passed a law that school classes can't start. I think that it was only like 8:10 or something was the earliest, which is an improvement, but still it should be pushed back a little bit more because that has an impact that makes your body less effective at doing other things regarding health. All right, now we'll jump way forward to nearer to the end of life in nursing homes. So one of the big things I want to get across here is that the majority of adults in the US are in a nursing home or hospital when they pass away. So nursing home is a option for a lot of people. And in a nursing home setting, and we've also seen this in, say, hospital settings, survival from a bunch of different ailments, whether you're elderly or not elderly. One of the biggest factors predicting if you will survive or live longer is perceived self-control. So in this specific study, 15% of residents who felt that they had more choices, so even if they didn't actually have more choices, even if they didn't have more choices than the other group, they felt like they had more choices. Those that felt that they were more in control, so their perceived self-control was higher, were more likely to be alive 18 months later than the 30% who felt that they didn't have very much control and were very dependent on staff. And we see this play out in a lot of different ways, like giving small or big choices, whether it's things like picking movies that you'll all watch, picking schedules, choosing more than one thing for a meal, being able to set your own time when you want to do a certain thing in the day, like have the group decide when they want to play bingo versus it being like handed down from the administration and the staff. And obviously, some things will have to be scheduled a little more because of practicality and scheduling. But the more choice that you can give a late adult in a nursing home, the more likely they are to be more engaged with the community, the more likely they are to have maybe more friends in the community, the more likely they are to survive longer and have higher well-being. And so it's a fairly simple thing. It's actually something that we talk about with early children as well. Give them more choices and they will learn to do more things. They'll be able to take on more responsibility. Kind of the same thing at the end of life. Give them more choices. In many cases, they still are very capable of making a lot of choices about their life. It's very sad when nursing homes are used as a place to kind of shovel off the elderly and leave them until they die. And that is the unfortunate reality for a lot of elderly in the United States, that they are kind of just shoved aside and kept quiet until they pass away versus those years in a nursing home can be good years of their life. They can enjoy it. They can have friendships. They can be doing things that they want to do, even if they have, say, mobility and health concerns that need constant attention. So that's a pretty dramatic study of the survivability of a nursing home just based on simple perceived self-control. All right, with that, your book also covers chronic disorders, and we'll touch on them a little bit, but this is a really big area of research, both in medicine and psychology. So the book covers arthritis, Alzheimer's, and Parkinson's. Here we have a picture of a brain that does not have Alzheimer's and then one that does. And your brain details a couple specific things about Alzheimer's that we can predict and prevent, but there are also other things that we can't. So one of the things that we talk about in class a lot is doing cognitively engaging things. So that can help stave off this loss and decrease of both brain mass and connections in the brain, but it can't stop it completely. It can help it. It can if you were, let's say, genetically and disease-wise expected to have a steep decline, it might smooth out that decline and have it happen a lot slower. By doing cognitively engaging things, a variety of treatments helps as well. So anything you can do for your brain really helps with that. Also, chronic disorders often appear in early adulthood. So while a lot of the focus in the book is late adulthood with chronic disorders, a lot of them we do first start to be diagnosed in early adulthood. That's not to say that some of them don't appear before that time in early adulthood, but that's often one of the times that they get diagnosed. So early adulthood and then kind of the end of middle adulthood, beginning of late adulthood are when some chronic disorders really are diagnosed at a higher rate, realizing, hey, something's not right. I need to get this checked out and going through the process. Because for some of these, especially something like fibromyalgia, it takes a long time for diagnosis, especially for fibromyalgia. At least as of right now, there's not one like really good test to say, yes, it's definitely fibromyalgia. Because things like arthritis, for example, some of those symptoms are the same as fibromyalgia. And so you've got to rule out arthritis first. And someone can have both arthritis and fibromyalgia. So essentially for fibromyalgia and for a lot of these, you kind of have to rule out the other possible disorders before you can settle on which one it actually is. Some are a little easier than others. So diabetes, for example, you can test things like glucose and blood sugar. You can do a drink a solution, see how that is being processed by your body. A little bit easier for that one. But not all of these chronic disorders have that easy way to diagnose it. And so that can be really challenging for a person in any phase of life, not really understanding what is happening to their body. They know things just don't feel quite right, but they aren't sure what is going on. So chronic disorders can be a heightened stressor, and some of them obviously can lead to other dramatic changes, say, in the brain as well. So taking preventative actions, being on top of your health care, talking to doctors about anything, even if it seems small, and with that, having good health care where you have the opportunity to talk to a doctor more is very helpful too. All right. So again, we're with each of these chapters, like the chapter on health, we're going through aspects of the entire lifespan. Your book usually in these chapters kind of goes in line through the lifespan in the chapter. We're going to do a little more jumping around because of things that are important to focus on. And one of those things is breastfeeding versus bottle feeding. So we were there at early adulthood and late adulthood with chronic disorders. Now we're at infancy. So, what is better, breastfeeding or bottle feeding? Well, in all of the studies, there's not a huge difference. So, we've got many, many studies across the world looking at breastfeeding versus bottle feeding. And what we see is that breastfeeding seems to be a little bit better than modern day formulas. And modern day formulas are much better than they were even 15 or 20 years ago. But breastfeeding still seems to be just a little bit better in some specific areas. But with that being said, some parents can't breastfeed, right? They either cannot do it with their schedule, they can't produce enough milk, a combination of those things, right? I've had family members who really wanted to breastfeed but weren't able to because of problems in breastfeeding, where they would have got, where they did get things like cysts or whatever, and they weren't able to breastfeed after that. So the most important thing is actually just feeding the baby, right? So yes, breastfeeding is slightly better. Like we have the data to show that, yeah, it's just slightly better. But the most important thing is feeding the baby. So there's a lot of people who don't produce enough milk, and so the baby is getting both breast milk and bottle milk as a supplement. So if the other partner who's not breastfeeding wants to be involved, oftentimes that's with a bottle. That might be formula. That might actually be the mother's milk as well. So feeding the baby is the most important. It's one thing that, because I still have fairly young children, I remember social media, uh, family, friends, and things looking down on people for their choice to bottle feed a child or their inability to breastfeed a child. And that's really terrible. That is not something people always have control over, right? And even if they do, the most important thing is feeding that baby. So it's not something to judge people for that choice and look down on people or bully them for. That's a really awful thing, and hopefully you don't teach that child to be a bully like that in the future. If you want a little more detail on this kind of area, this is a really good video on some of the research overall, but you can also use some of the resources like looking through the library and looking for, say, a meta-analysis about the benefits of breastfeeding and the benefits of bottle feeding. So feeding the baby is most important. If you're looking at the data and the statistics, yes, breastfeeding is slightly better, but it's but modern day formulas are overall pretty good, even though they are fairly expensive. So there is a choice there to be made as well. All right, so jumping ahead to another aspect of nutrition and eating behavior in early childhood, on healthy eating in childhood, and we will look at healthy eating through the rest of the lifespan.
The ultimate answer to the childhood obesity epidemic is to deal with what's been called our toxic environment, with junk food everywhere, advertising of unhealthful products to kids, inadequate opportunities for physical activity. But that's going to be a long-term prospect. We can begin to protect our children immediately in one environment through which we have 100% control, and that's the home. Parents can use very basic behavioral change practices to begin to guide their children to a healthy lifestyle right away. And that's in fact the focus of the work that we do in the Optimal Weight for Life, or the OWL program at Children's Hospital Boston. The two key parenting practices really at any age are called protecting the home environment and modeling. Protecting the home environment simply means if it doesn't support health, don't bring it in the home. You can say no once to your kids when they're asking you for that gallon of ice cream in the supermarket, or you can try to say no every night when they're nagging you for it if it's sitting in the freezer.
Or you can do like I sometimes do and say, "Oh, sorry, I forgot to buy that," because sometimes that's true. Or sometimes it's a lie. But no, don't lie to the kids. Just tell them, no, we're trying to eat healthier. So it's easier to do that when it's not in the house. You might not be happy about it, but it is a true and honest response. When I'm craving something sweet and there's not actually something sweet in the fridge, I end up eating something, either not eating something, which might be what I need, or eating something a little bit healthier than I would have otherwise.
The same also applies to physical activity. Let's not have a high-definition, widescreen television in every room. Let's put opportunities for physical activity, active games, kids can close the doors, have fun, and enjoy themselves. A second key parenting practice is called modeling. And the idea here is that if you do it, they'll do it. But the opposite is also true. If you don't do it, they won't do it. When parents are eating well and engaging in a physically active lifestyle, they'll be modeling the right behaviors for the overweight or obese child, and the parents' own cardiovascular risk factors improve.
So a big key with that, and we'll watch a little bit more of this in a second, but a big key with that is also um, the fact that oh, the fact that with modeling, you can really show a range of behaviors. So a lot of the things that we talk about throughout this class, a lot of it will come back to that modeling, like you as the parent or a parent figure for a child are modeling an appropriate behavior. So a lot of the body size for early children is just based on genetics. And you'll see that for someone who has genetics to be more overweight, it can be a lot harder for them to maintain a weight or lose weight as well. So if you have those parents who have that genetic tendency as well, you might see, oftentimes what we see is the patterns that the parents are doing are the patterns that the children start doing as well. So if those parents at any time change their patterns, it's going to be more supportive of those children as well. Just like if you're in middle adulthood, changing those patterns out will help you be more healthy at any point, whether or not there are children as a model that you can be a model for.
All too often, parents resort to negative practices like nagging, punishment, criticism. Very common for parents to try to force their kids to eat foods that they think are healthy, like fruits and vegetables, or excessively restrict other foods like candy. But these practices tend to backfire. They make the kid dislike fruits and vegetables and actually crave those restricted foods even more. Instead, we encourage practices like praise, goal setting, self-monitoring, something we call empowerment, where kids actually participate in food preparation, even food selection. And we have a saying that if they cook it, or if they select it in the store, they'll probably eat it. Many parents are working multiple jobs, leaving little time to shop for and prepare foods at home. Also, especially in some inner city communities, fast food is cheap and available, and nutritious food ingredients like fruits and vegetables can be very expensive or literally unavailable. Yet another factor is that children are under a lot of stress, almost ridiculously early in life. Young children are under academic pressures to exceed in scholastic studies, and this can not only limit time for being outdoors, playing, and relaxing, but also put so much stress on a young child that it influences their eating habits. They may turn to food for comfort, and obesity is the almost unavoidable consequence.
So lots of good ideas there in that video about how to make eating a little bit more healthy. So with that, heredity can be a protective or risk factor. That goes back to what I was saying, that the genetics of the parents, if they're more likely to be obese, the child will probably have that genetic capacity too. If the genetics are to not be as obese, that could be a protective factor, right? So it could be a risk factor, it could be a protective factor. It's very often both because of genetics as well as family lifestyles and choices and the behaviors at home that lead the child to pick up some of those same patterns. And we'll see that in a lot of different areas as we talk about modeling and parenting across the course of this course. So as we get to later on in childhood, so even teenage years, some of the main things in the environment that we can do to have protective factors are one, regular meal times. So having a child know when the time is for the meal so their body can be used to that, fill up and use up that fuel and doing that at regular times. Obviously, with kids, you're going to find that they will get hungry before or after sometimes, but a regular meal time helps them know when food is coming. Screen time. So, limiting screen time can really help. So, having them do things that are more active, whether it's just dancing in their room or playing around in their room, if you're able to go outside or something like that, that can be a lot better for their weight and their overall health. We'll talk about exercise in a couple minutes, actually, more specifically. Schools are doing a much better job at offering healthy foods. Should have a Y there, health foods, but I guess the point gets across. And then for parents and other adults, modeling eating behaviors and providing healthy foods for them. So making sure that it's easier to access those healthy foods. When we recently moved to our new house here in Washington, we had a basket that we just hadn't used the whole time we lived in our older house. And we put it out on the middle of the table and put a bunch of fruits and vegetable or fruits in it that were like oranges, apples, some bananas, that kind of thing. And the kids were like, wow, it looks so fancy. And I don't know why they thought it looked fancy, but they thought it did, and then they ate a bunch of stuff. So every time that I notice we have moved that basket away from the middle of the table, I'll put some fruit in it and put it back, right? Because if there's too many things on the table, if someone's doing homework on it, it might get moved away. So having it there, having access, they eat a ton more of the fruits than if it is not there, if it's not there to access, and if they don't see it. So, especially for some kids, if they don't see it, it's not there, they're not going to look through the fridge unless they know there's something in there that they want, like, say, chocolate milk or something. But if they see that, they'll grab something more healthy. It's probably not a good idea to have donuts sitting out in the middle of the table for a long period of time anyway. All right, so continuing on with nutrition and eating behavior, another thing I want to focus a little bit of time on is anorexia and eating disorders in general. So, anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, and binge eating disorders are all examples of eating disorders. Uh, there is a commonality between them that is really interesting. Many of them actually begin during an episode of dieting. So, it's an interesting thing with the way that the brain is seeing their own body, and then based on how you kind of get the sense that they have not the proper sense, they're looking in the mirror and they see something very different than their body actually is from this image, right? And so that is a very common symptom of a lot of eating disorders, and a lot of them start when starting a diet or partway through a diet. They might get positive reinforcement for having been on a diet, and then they just continue to diet to the extreme. They start to develop an unhealthy view of their own body, not seeing it as it really is. There's a lot of similarities between, especially anorexia and bulimia. This difference here is anorexia is mostly characterized by limiting food intake and calorie intake, versus bulimia, you're taking in and then you're purging that. And so bulimia, you can see some outward signs sometimes a little more easily, like teeth, for example, getting hurt by the stomach acid. Anorexia, it's hard to catch earlier on because it's a slower, more gradual change in the outward appearance of the child. But oftentimes, um, children and teenagers and even adults are talking with other friends, part of groups, whether it be on social media or in person, that are really focused on their weight. So with that, that is one thing to be aware of, especially in, say, adolescence, if you're monitoring a child, is oftentimes these eating disorders will begin after a period of dieting. It might even be a completely healthy plan to do a diet, right? But then in that process, with the patterns of reinforcement and the way that they are seeing their body might be changing, can lead to this in any of these eating disorders in some cases. One nice thing though, cognitive behavioral therapy is really effective as a treatment for a lot of eating disorders. So, cognition is the way we're thinking about ourselves, seeing ourselves, thinking about ourselves, those internal processes, and behaviorism is basically changing that behavior. So, doing things to reinforce better and more healthy behaviors for us. So definitely something to be aware of. It is not just these are not just diseases for adolescents. These are not just diseases for women as well. So these disorders are for all people. So definitely something to watch out for, especially if you are monitoring anybody, even if it's, say, a peer or a friend. All right, another thing is that we do see a lot of obesity as well. Obesity is correlated with lots of bad things: early death, having higher blood pressure, diabetes, cardiovascular diseases, depression. And so each of these, in and of themselves, can be both a cause and a correlate. So a lot of these have a looping system. So you might be depressed, and one of the things that you're doing is eating more. Then you become more obese, then you become more depressed because you're not happy with how you're seeing yourself, right? So some of these can feed into each other in a lot of different ways and be a really negative downward spiral. We see that obesity is on the rise in a lot of countries around the world. A lot of this is down to some of the ingredients and ways that we prepare food and make food to market so that people want to eat it and find it really tasty. But also, there are things that we can do in our environment and with our eating behaviors that can reduce these things. But it is a really serious thing across the lifespan. So even in early childhood, obesity, especially in early childhood, a lot of body variations that you see are genetic. It's just based on genetics. It's into middle childhood, late childhood, adolescence, where the body variations are more down to like eating behaviors than they were earlier on. So, because obesity is such a correlate and cause of some of these other risk factors, it is a really big deal to try and reduce obesity to try and have a healthy life. And so some of these protective factors that we've talked about in the past couple slides, regular meal time, reducing screen time, healthy foods, exercising, modeling of healthy behaviors, these are really big. At any point of life, changing the patterns that you are part of is going to set you up for more health later on, right? I guess changing the patterns to something more positive. So changing to more healthy eating behaviors is going to set you up for better success, more healthy body later down the line. Versus if you don't do that, well, you won't get those benefits. So adding protective factors, reducing those risk factors at any point of life is good. So even if you only start eating healthy in late adulthood, you will extend your life. You will reduce your risk of high blood pressure, of cardiovascular disease. So any change at any time is positive. So, with that being said, how can we lose weight? I know it is a difficult thing. So, after recent surgeries, I was essentially immobile for almost a year and I gained a lot of weight. And it's been very hard to lose that weight at my age, especially. So, and it just gets worse as you get a little older. But some of the main things, some of the key simple things that research has found is one, eating healthy. So it's not necessarily that a specific diet will work for everybody. There might be things that you don't want to eat, you don't like to eat. You might have other dietary restrictions, like not able to eat gluten. You might have specific allergies. So there's not like one single diet that's best for everybody. Everybody's bodies has variations. But eating healthy things. So, and finding those things that work for you and that you like to eat. So, with that, planning meals in advance. And there's a lot of apps and tools that you can use to help do this, to plan out meals. A lot of apps that you can use will tell you, well, if you want these meals, you can just buy these ingredients in these many amounts. And so that can be really helpful as well. So planning meals in advance, so you're not sitting there and like, oh, what in the world am I going to eat? You have a billion choices when you've already been at work all day and you're making more choices now that you're home. If you've limited it down to say, well, this week I was going to make like these 5 dinners, that is a little easier to choose from. So planning meals in advance so you have those ingredients, that kind of thing really helps, especially when it's healthy meals. Tracking weight. So the researchers for this, they suggested tracking weight every single day. Other studies I've seen with weight loss say track it, say once a week, and you can see bigger drops more frequently. Because one thing that you want is positive reinforcement, right? You want to be able to see that number go down. And sometimes maybe you drank more water the day before or that morning, or maybe you drank an entire pot of coffee, and so that affects your weight a little bit. So that can be a challenge, but definitely tracking that weight, whether it's daily, whether it's weekly. And another big thing that we'll get into in a lot more detail in a second is exercise. So exercising at least 30 minutes a day, as we will see across the lifespan, the requirement for a healthy body in early childhood is more than 30 minutes a day, but then as we get to late adulthood, it's 30 minutes a day. So 30 minutes a day is basically the bare minimum that you should be active, and that could be intense activity and moderate activity, but you should be active. So with that, a lot of the genetic factors for obesity are countered, are basically that risk factor of having the genes for obesity is cut out or reduced with higher activity levels. And so these are some pretty simple things. The hard thing is implementing them. The hard thing is changing patterns to be able to be tracking weight, changing patterns to be able to exercise. Exercise can be a really difficult thing. Eating healthy can be a really difficult thing. But the sooner you start those patterns, the easier it's going to be to do it. And with that being said, those are the main things to help people lose weight. A lot of the weight loss is down to what you're eating, what you're putting into your body. But we see that people who are most successful at losing weight do include exercise in their programs. And with that being said, our bodies and our brains need that exercise as well. So eating healthy, exercising, big, big things, which is simple to say, but the actual implementation is hard and very individual. So it might be easy for you to find the time to exercise, or it might be nearly impossible for you to find time to be physically active. Getting access to healthy food might be really easy for you, or it might be very difficult to find healthy foods that you can actually eat. So everybody's different with this. So changing those patterns, even changing one of them. So this is basically a list of 4 things. eating healthy, planning meals, tracking weight, exercising. So if you make a change on one of those to stay consistent, and that's a big thing, is staying consistent with that healthy behavior throughout your lifespan. All right, so let's jump into exercise. I've alluded to exercise quite a few times in this class already, but let's talk about exercise in early childhood. So, young children need to be physically active a lot more than you might generally think. It needs to be, the recommendations are 15 or more minutes every hour, and it works out to overall about 3 hours per day of physical activity total. So, 15 minutes per hour while they're awake. So with that, that can be a lot of different range of things, right? In early childhood, it's not recommended for children to do like weightlifting classes, right? So something like that is not going to be as good for their bones and their ligaments. In early childhood, the main thing is activities. So whether this is just running outside and playing in the woods, whether this is or like in the backyard on a playground, whether this is like dancing in their room, right? There's a lot of ways a child can be physically active. And the main thing here is that children's lives should really focus around activities rather than meals. And as a parent, I know it's a lot easier, especially when we're talking about having regular meal times, to say, okay, this is the time for lunch, this is the time for dinner, this is the time for breakfast, and plan around that. It's a lot better to, one, help children like plan out the activities that they want to do for a day, but also have them have set activities. So whether it's that they have a sport on Saturdays and maybe they need to practice it once a week or something like that, having activities planned or having the availability of more physical activities. So rather than an activity like playing Nintendo Switch, which they would probably love to do, limiting that more than say I sometimes have with my own children, and encouraging like playing outside, playing in the room, playing Legos is still a little bit more physically. So something like playing with Legos or this example here of playing in a children's museum is a lot more physically active than they would be just sitting and staring at a screen. So the physical activity is going to be at all ranges. They're going to be getting their heart rates up sometimes when they're chasing cats around the house. They're going to be a little bit active when they're doing something like playing Legos, right? These are the kinds of activities children need to be doing across the day. So basically playing. Children need to be playing. Play a lot of the day, 15 minutes per hour, overall 3 hours a day. Part of that's going to be if they're in school at recess time, but also that needs to be like after school time as well. So kids don't need to say do a specific workout. They don't even need to be part of like a specific team sport unless that's something that they want to do, but they should be actively playing a lot of the day in general. So as we move into early childhood, we also need to be doing more physical activity than we generally expect for an early child. So exercise might be more formal at this point. It doesn't have to be. Again, for an early child, still play is the most important. Being active, kind of like the like earlier in childhood, as we get into middle childhood even, we might start to want to work out with, say, parents. And remember, parents should be modeling appropriate behavior. So when my child was about 4 and they saw me doing weightlifting, they're like, I want to lift weights. And well, I knew, no, lifting weights is not good for you, but how about this? How about you go and make out of your Legos a dumbbell or something like that? And so then they could like do their weights. And their weights were literally a Lego that they created as a weight. And they could do that with me. And they would do maybe 5 or 10 minutes of the workout, be bored with it, and then go do something else. But that kind of activity, that kind of modeling is helpful. And the reason exercise is so good across the lifespan is it really helps us practice attention. So if you're, whether it's playing a game, right? Whether you're playing a team sport, whether you are searching around for bugs outside, whether it is that you are like making a game in your house or dancing, you're paying attention, you're focusing your attention, you're using those cognitive faculties, you're using your memory, you're calling on things, especially if you're with other people as well, to like plan out something. So the other day, one of my children came home and they're like, hey, this is the game we played at recess today. Do you want to play it with me? Like they were using their memory there. They were also doing goal-directed thinking. They wanted to do this, so they had to set a plan to make it happen, right? There was another day they wanted to like make their own kind of in-person game, like we were the game pieces, like jumping around the house kind of thing. And then it kind of devolved into just the floor is lava, which is one of my favorite games. So I was happy about that. But yeah, that's goal-directed thinking. They're practicing using their mind. And while they could say, play a video game that does work on their attention, does work on their memory, and does work on their goal-directed thinking, they wouldn't necessarily be getting the physical benefit at the same time. Also, you can have video games that are creative, that inspire creativity, but they're often going to be very, very creative when they are playing. So play is very important for these cognitive abilities that are super useful both across the lifespan and in adulthood. And that's true for adults as well. Doing things like play, planning out to play a game, whether you're part of a basketball league, right? Or whether you're doing a weightlifting workout, right? You do have to use like attention, memory, goal-directed thinking, creativity sometimes. So that is something that is very helpful for your cognition across the lifespan. So for early childhood, play is the main thing. They might be part wanting to do as they're getting into middle childhood, some more formal exercise. Unless it's part of a team sport, it's not really necessary to do some kind of like formal exercise routine in until basically adolescence. So, with this, adolescents, only about 48.6% of adolescents meet the minimum recommendations. And that minimum recommendations is 60 minutes of moderate to vigorous activity. So, moderate to vigorous, your heart rate is up. You're probably sweating with moderate. You're definitely sweating with vigorous activity. And so that is the minimum. And a lot of adolescents are not meeting that. So again, this goes back to like healthy habits. So your risk of fighting off infection, the way your body's working, the way your brain is working is going to be better with this kind of activity. And so for an adolescent, this might be a team sport where they get their 60 minutes of vigorous activity or moderate to vigorous activity. It might be just playing outside, doing hikes, maybe going with friends and going to the park. When I was an adolescent, I would go to the park and do parkour basically. So something like that. Finding things that adolescents actually want to do, that they like to do. And that really applies as we go age up as well, is finding things that make you get active that you want to do. So if an adolescent wants to run and wants to do jogging, great. If they want to play soccer, great. If they want to do gymnastics or dance, if they want to do martial arts, right? These are all really good examples of ways to be active. It could be a team sport. It doesn't have to be. It could be more individual. It could be something like dance. It could be in the home. It might be out of the home. But that 60 minutes a day is pretty important for the brain to continue to develop these skills. So these attention, memory, goal-directed thinking, creativity skills, that is used when playing or doing more formalized exercise. So it doesn't have to be formal exercise programs at this time. Some adolescents might prefer that. Can be things like team sports, or it can be more just play extended into adolescence. So all of these good exercise habits really lead to, and this is for across the lifespan, but we can measure this already in childhood. So lower blood pressure, lower incidence of type 2 diabetes, improved sleep. So again, we talked earlier in the chapter about how adolescents aren't getting enough sleep. If they are more physically active, they tend to sleep better. Lower depression rates. So one of the so after both cognitive behavioral therapy, well, after a variety of therapies, so therapies and medicine for depression, those are both very effective on their own. They're more effective when you put them together as well. The next most effective thing for treating depression is exercise, like moderate to vigorous activity. So, I saw a funny TikTok about someone complaining about doing a mental health walk, but that it actually worked, that they didn't want to go out and do it, but as they do it, they do feel better. And that's the case with a lot of exercise. It might be hard, it might be very difficult to fit into schedules, um, but it is very helpful for both our brain and our body. And so, overall, greater psychological well being. So, these healthy habits of healthy eating, healthy sleeping, healthy exercise across the lifespan, anytime you can start and change those patterns to be a little more healthy, the better off your outcomes, the more well being you'll have, the more health you'll have overall. So with this, as we jump into adulthood, the book kind of gets a little muddy in the book of what is for early adulthood versus middle adulthood versus late adulthood. So closer to early to mid adulthood should be about 45 minutes of moderate physical activity most days of the week. So you could think of that like 4 or 5 days out of 7. And especially as you're getting into adulthood, more of this should focus on aerobic exercises. So, stimulating your heart, stimulating your lungs, those are some of the most important components to be working harder, essentially. So, the recommendation is get your heart rate up to 60% of maximum. And I think that was for the at least, it was about, it might have been 60% actually, for like 60% of your workout. Good ways to do this: jogging, swimming, cycling. If you hate all those things like dance, and that's a challenge, right? As kids, it's maybe easier to play, have time to play, and just do things that you enjoy. As adolescents, maybe you're part of team sports or doing things with your friends. In adulthood, sometimes it's the case that all you have is, say, 30 minutes and your house. What are you going to do with that time? You might not be able to go. I used to live in a very snowy place. There weren't many people running. There were still a few people who would run in the snow. That wasn't me. Jogging, uh, I don't find it fun, and that's a challenge, right? In adulthood, to find something that you find fun. Swimming, you need access to a pool to do swimming, right? Cycling, you need access to a bike, a place to store a bike as well. So it can be difficult, but anything that can bring your heart rate up, there's a lot of aerobic exercise programs. There's a lot of free accessible ones on YouTube. That's actually one thing that I use is some like video workouts that I follow, but it took a while to find ones that I actually like. A lot of the video trainers is great on my nerves, and I can't stand them. So I'll stop watching it, even though it would be healthy for me to continue. It was very annoying for them to be like, "Keep going, or why?" Or like being negative towards the participants. Like, I don't have to take this from you. I'm turning this off. Maybe it would be different if it was in person. Maybe I wouldn't. But I've also not tried that, a personal trainer. But with this, this is probably a lot more physical exercise than you were considering in early adulthood. And it doesn't change too much into middle adulthood as well. We're getting down to the point where the lowest minimum is about 30 minutes of moderate physical activity for the rest of your life. But a main thing in adulthood is getting that heart rate up using those lungs. So with that, I mentioned earlier that one of the kind of exercises I like to do is weightlifting. So any kind of resistance exercise. So this can be resistance bands, this can be machines that are resistance, this can be literal weights. As we get into middle adulthood and especially late adulthood, but setting those patterns earlier is better. Resistance exercises do preserve and increase muscle mass. So and with that, they also preserve bone mass. So we've talked about in previous chapters, well, depending on when you're getting this chapter in this class, humans do tend to shrink. We do lose some bone mass. One way to reduce that, to be maintaining the bone mass we do have, is through resistance exercises. So again, that can be resistance bands, that can be machines, that can be lifting actual weights. With this, definitely don't forget to stretch. Oftentimes that makes your muscle quite tight doing these kind of resistance exercises or weightlifting. Do stretch. You should stretch with all of these, but especially as you get into middle adulthood and late adulthood, that stretching is very important. It might be okay for some people's bodies in adolescence to kind of skip the stretching, but as you are getting older and as those body components are um, starting to have some aging processes happening to them, stretching can be really important. And I really liked this little thing that came across my feed the other day while I was actually thinking of updating these slides. The fact that I've got to train 3 to 5 days a week to keep my body at a moderately broken, while my cat can sleep all day and do parkour with ease, is a crime. And I feel that as someone who likes to do parkour and doesn't get enough time to do it, uh, the fact that when I do go out, I'm so much less fluid and cat-like as I used to be, is very frustrating to see my cat sleep for so many hours of the day, then jump up and run around and get the zoomies and do crazy parkour. But I mean, that's evolution. They evolved for that, and I didn't evolve for that. So with that being said, aerobic exercise, again, should definitely be a focus of workouts for adults to get that heart rate up, to get the lungs working. But resistance exercises can really help for your bones and your muscles. All right, one thing that we see as well is that in studies of middle age and older adults, so this is middle adulthood, late adulthood, adults who are more sedentary were much more likely to die during the course of the study. So this study lasted for 8 years. So adults who were so adults who were moderately fit versus highly fit. So there were like three categories. You were sedentary, moderately fit, highly fit. So those that were sedentary, that weren't doing aerobic exercises, that weren't doing weight exercises or resistance exercises, those who were sedentary, mostly sitting around kind of things and not moving their bodies. And again, not everybody has the mobility to be able to like stand up and run, right? So, but there are other exercises that you can do. Again, talk to doctors, talk to physical therapists, especially. They're really good at knowing how to do these things. Physical therapists, that's literally what they train for, is that despite your limitations, these are ways that you can exercise and work your body, get things like heart rate up and use and maintain the capacities that you do have. So definitely talk to physical therapists about that. But for this group, 10,000 people over the course of 8 years, those who were sedentary were twice as likely to die than the moderately fit people, and three times more likely to die than the highly fit people. So it is literally a matter of life and death. Exercise reduces the cardiovascular problems. It maintains capacities, maintains cognition. And in many senses, if we look at some of these exercise forms, look, this person they're with other people around them. Maybe they develop friendships and are able to have other places to go, other people to interact with. That keeps you more cognitively healthy. Altogether, exercise is a really big impact for adults. So looking at later adulthood, so after we get past 60, the recommendation basically until you die is still 30 minutes of moderately intense activity 5 days a week. And a good recommendation to include here is also 2 or more days of strength training per week. So that's that kind of resistance training, maintaining muscle mass, because as we get to that age, we're starting to lose muscle mass and bone density at a higher rate. So doing more to maintain those capacities is going to keep us feeling better and living better, having higher well-being across our lifespan. It's also, again, a good way to interact with other people if you are doing a workout group with people. So, and a hard thing though is for adults to find exercise that they enjoy, that they will be motivated to do. It can be difficult for a lot of people to find time, find the energy, find space, have the money to do exercise programs. So finding what can work with the limitations that you have is a really big key of this. And another piece of that is that as an adult, you might be modeling that exercise behavior to children if you have them. Again, anytime you can change any of these healthy patterns to be more healthy is going to have a bigger long-term positive impact for you across your lifespan. So if you are in an in-person class, we're going to do this kind of activity in person. If you're in a hybrid or online class, depending on what it is, you'll have some activities around, well, how can you figure out exercises? Because that's a big thing is across the lifespan, I'm looking to help people be more healthy, have more health and fitness, preserve their minds. And a lot of these basic, simple things that you've heard your entire life are really very well researched. So we need to be eating healthy, getting good sleep. We need to uh, have beyond the self-engagement, be involved with people. We need to be preserving our minds and doing that, have things that we care about doing, and be taking care of our bodies through that healthy eating, sleep, and exercise. So going back to the um, early childhood, 15 plus minutes every hour that they're awake. So 3 hours a day. Then as we jump to adolescence, we've got about 60 minutes a day that we need to be exercising. And then about 45 or more minutes a day in early adulthood. And then kind of the last point is 30 minutes of moderate intensity activity, at least 5 days a week with some resistance training in that. So we do need to be more active than most people in the US generally are. If you're doing something like biking to work, for example, you might be doing this just in your commute, right? So there are ways that you can change and adjust your lifespan. So a big thing to think of is what is it that you want to be doing? What might you want to be doing at 70, right? To be physically active. Some people really like to do things like racquetball or badminton or have a weekly meetup and play basketball. So figure out things that work for you within your schedule, within your budget, within your body limitations or abilities to figure out how you can be active. Because while this chapter is short and while these are kind of simple things that you've heard your entire life, they are all incredibly important. So hopefully you learned a lot about health across the lifespan and had a couple ideas of how you can maybe change things in your own life to have healthy patterns and help other people as well to have healthy patterns in their lives too.